You know the feeling. You say something true, and somewhere behind you, someone smiles like you're the one who doesn't understand. You don't argue. You don't raise your voice. You just wait, because you've learned that being right and being believed are two very different things. Sometimes, the truth doesn't need you to defend it at all. Here's where it begins. A single chalk mark appeared on the rim of a freight wheel. Small, white, shaped like a rough X. No one had drawn it there to be seen. By the time the light turned gold over the grain elevator, it would matter more than anyone yet understood. A man walked the length of the train. A short steel bar sat in one hand. He moved from wheel to wheel, unhurried. He had walked that same line for 31 years. His cap had gone soft with age. His jacket held the color of old rain clouds. He did not look at the sky. He listened. Would anyone still trust an ear over a machine? Not in a year when machines were supposed to know everything. Frank Doyle had inspected cars at the Oakridge depot longer than most of the yard crew had been alive. The depot itself was small. A low building. A stove that never quite warmed the whole room. It sat at the edge of a county built on wheat and corn, more of both than almost anywhere else in that stretch of the Midwest. Every autumn, the same freight cars rolled past that depot, carrying grain from farms Frank had known his whole life. Families whose trucks he could still name by sound alone. The rails ran through the middle of it all, quiet and steady. A river runs the same way. It asks no one for permission. Frank arrived before the sky had fully let go of night. He always did. It was a habit older than his marriage, older than the house he lived in, older almost than the depot's newer roof. He unlocked the side door with the same brass key he had carried since his first year on the job. The teeth were worn smooth from 3 decades of pockets. Inside, the stove ticked as it warmed. He hung his coat on the same hook he always used, second from the door. He poured coffee from a pot that had likely seen more sunrises than most of the men now working the yard. He liked the quiet before the trucks started arriving. The stillness gave the whole place a kind of held breath, as though the depot itself was waiting to see what the day would bring. Outside, frost still clung to the rails in thin silver lines the way it did most mornings that time of year. Frank walked out to check the yard before anyone else arrived, breath fogging in the cold air, boots crunching over frozen gravel. He liked this part of the job least discussed and most necessary. A yard walked in silence told a man things a busy afternoon never could. That particular morning, the yard was busier than usual. A string of grain cars sat coupled and waiting. They were bound for the main line by nightfall, carrying the last of the season's harvest out toward the mills. Frank had checked trains like this 1,000 times before. He knew the sound of a good wheel the way another man knows his own name, called across a crowded room. He remembered learning that sound, once from a man named Earl Pruitt, who had inspected cars at the same depot back when Frank was barely 20 and still unsure of most things. Earl never explained much. He would strike a wheel, wait, and simply say, "Listen again," until one day the difference finally arrived on its own. The way learning to swim arrives, not through explanation, but through repetition. Frank had never forgotten that morning. He tried, in his own quiet way, to pass along the same patience whenever a younger man showed any interest in listening rather than simply reading a gauge. The new supervisor arrived a little after 7, carrying a case that looked too clean for a rail yard. His name was Nathan Cole. He had transferred in from a larger district 3 months earlier, fresh out of a 2-year technical program that had taught him wiring diagrams, sensor calibration, and diagnostic software, but almost nothing about the sound a tired axle makes before it fails. He was young enough that some of the older crew still called him the new man, and meant no harm by it. He set the case on the hood of a parked truck. He lifted out a handheld device, a small screen, a probe on a coiled cable. He explained, briefly, that the department had finally approved new inspection units, even for small depots like this one. No more guessing, he said. No more relying on a man's ear on a cold morning, when his hearing might not be what it once was. The machine would read every wheel in seconds, and the numbers did not have opinions. Frank nodded once. He nodded at most things these days. Then he went back to walking the line, bar in hand. It was not that he minded the machine. It was that he had 40 years of mornings just like this one. Not one of them had ever lied to him. He moved down the row of grain cars. He struck each wheel near the rim. He paused half a second after every strike, letting the sound travel back to him. A good wheel rang. Clean, high, almost musical. The kind of sound that told you the metal was whole, unbroken all the way through. A bad wheel answered differently. Duller, shorter, as if something inside had already given up part of its voice. Nathan worked the far end of the same train. His new device moved faster than Frank's bar. He pressed the probe to each wheel. He watched numbers scroll across the small screen. Pass, pass, pass. He called the readings out loud when he passed close enough, more from habit than anything else. The way a person narrates a task, just to fill a silence they are not quite used to. A truck pulled up to the grain elevator across the yard, the third that morning. A farmer named Herb Callahan climbed down from the cab, lifting a hand toward Frank the way he always did. A small gesture between two men who had known each other longer than either cared to count. Herb's family had shipped wheat out of Oakridge since before the war. His grandfather's name was still faintly visible on an old ledger kept in a drawer at the depot office, ink on the color of weak tea. Frank lifted a hand back. Neither man said anything more. There was nothing that needed saying. The wheat would go out the same way it always had, carried by rails Frank checked every morning without fail. Behind the depot, half hidden by weeds, an old steam engine sat retired on a short stub of disconnected track, left there decades earlier as a kind of monument no one had ever gotten around to removing. Frank passed it every day without much thought. Children from town sometimes climbed on it in the summer, pretending at journeys the engine itself had stopped making long before most of their parents were born. It had once pulled grain out of this same county the slow, heavy way, boiler roaring, long before diesel engines took over the line and made the whole operation faster, quieter, and far less forgiving of a missed detail. Frank sometimes thought the old engine and Earl Pruitt would have understood each other. Neither one had ever needed a screen to know when something was wrong. By mid-morning, the two men had nearly met in the middle of the train. Frank reached a wheel on the seventh car. It sat loaded heavy with wheat, bound for a mill 3 counties over. He struck it the way he had struck every wheel before it. He stopped. He struck it again. The second sound was almost the same as the first. Almost. A person without 31 years of listening would never have caught the difference. But Frank stood there a moment longer than usual. His head tilted slightly. The bar hung loose in his hand. He was listening to an echo only he seemed to hear. Nathan reached the same car a minute later. He ran his device over the wheel Frank had just struck. The screen returned a clean reading. No flags, no warnings. A perfectly ordinary number, sitting inside a perfectly ordinary range. He looked over, expecting to move on. Frank said the wheel sounded a little duller than the ones beside it. Not much, just enough to notice. Nathan checked the screen again, more out of politeness than doubt. He said the numbers were clean across the board. He said it kindly enough, the way a person speaks to someone they respect but do not want to argue with. Maybe the wind was carrying the sound differently that morning, he offered. Maybe hearing simply changed with age, the way it does for everyone eventually. He did not say it to wound anyone. He said it the way a young man says something he genuinely believes to be true. Frank did not argue. He had never once, in 31 years, tried to win an argument about a sound. He only asked, quietly, if he might take one more pass at that wheel before the train left that evening. Nathan said that was fine. There was no harm in it. He moved on down the line, calling out another string of clean readings, the numbers fading into the ordinary noise of the yard. Frank reached into his jacket pocket. He took out a short piece of chalk. He crouched beside the wheel, found a spot low on the rim, mostly hidden beneath the brake shoe. He drew a small, rough X, not to prove anything to anyone. He had marked wheels like this his entire career, long before any machine existed to disagree with him. It was simply what a person did when a small doubt refused to leave quietly. The morning moved on without him. Trucks came and went from the grain elevator across the yard. farmers backed up to the loading chute, the way they had every autumn for as long as the depot had stood there. A boy no older than 10 sat on the tailgate of one truck, swinging his legs. He watched the freight cars the way boys always seem to watch trains, as if something important might happen at any moment. Frank caught the boy's eye once and offered a small nod. The boy nodded back, solemn, as if he understood something about the seriousness of trains that most adults had long forgotten. It reminded Frank, briefly, of himself at that age, standing near these same tracks with his own father, listening to a sound he could not yet name but already loved. The boy's father called him down from the tailgate before the truck pulled away. The boy went, reluctant, glancing back once at the freight cars as though leaving something unfinished behind him. Frank watched the truck ease out of the yard and turn toward the county road, dust rising pale behind it in the morning light. He thought, not for the first time, that every boy who ever loved trains eventually grew into one kind of man or another. Some forgot the sound entirely. A few never quite did. Nothing happened yet. Not the kind of thing the boy was hoping for. But Frank understood that particular kind of waiting better than most. Frank spent the middle of the day at the ordinary work of an inspector. He checked brake lines. He walked couplers. He filled out reports in handwriting that had grown smaller and neater with age, rather than looser, as though he had decided, somewhere along the way, that his notes needed to outlast his memory. He ate lunch alone at the same bench he always chose. A thermos of black coffee sat beside him. He watched the grain cars sit quiet in the afternoon light. He thought, without meaning to, about retirement. It was not far off now. A year, maybe 2. Someone else would walk this line eventually. He wondered, some days, what would happen to the listening itself, once no one left at the depot still knew how to do it. It was not a bitter thought, just a quiet one, the kind that arrives more often the older a person gets. Across the yard, the grain elevator kept its own steady rhythm, trucks idling in line, the low grind of the auger carrying grain up into the tall gray bins. Frank had watched that same rhythm every autumn of his working life. Different trucks, different faces, some years. The same patient waiting, the same trust that the harvest, once loaded, would arrive somewhere safely. He had never once thought of himself as an important man. He simply understood, in the plain way a person understands the weather, that safe arrivals did not happen by accident. Someone had to walk the line first. Someone always had. A second truck rolled up near the elevator. An old blue pickup dented tailgate. A woman climbed out this time, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She called a greeting across the yard to no one in particular. Frank recognized her as Marilyn Weiss. Her land bordered Herb Callahan's on the east side. Her late husband had once helped repair a section of the depot roof years back after a bad hailstorm tore through the county. She waved toward Frank without stopping, the way neighbors do when there is work still ahead of them. Frank raised a hand in return. Then he went back to his coffee. He watched the ordinary business of the yard continue around him, steady as it had been for 3 decades. There is a particular kind of knowing that never shows up on paper. It is not a mystery. It is not magic either. It is closer to what a farmer means when he says he can feel rain coming before the sky admits to it, or what a mother means when she says she knew something was wrong before her child said a word. It is simply attention paid so consistently for so many years that it stops feeling like a skill. It starts feeling like instinct instead. A machine can measure what already exists. It cannot yet measure the shape of something just beginning to form. What happens, then, in the years before a new kind of knowledge fully replaces an old one? Does the old knowledge vanish quietly, or does it simply wait and used until the day it turns out to have been right all along? Frank did not resent the new device. He had watched enough changes move through the yard over 3 decades to know that most of them made the work safer eventually. He only knew, the way he knew very few things with complete certainty, that 31 years of listening had never once failed him on a day that mattered. By early afternoon, Nathan finished his own pass through the yard. He found himself, without quite planning to, walking back toward the bench where Frank sat. He asked, mostly to fill the silence, how long Frank had been doing this work. Frank told him. Nathan seemed surprised, though he tried not to show it too plainly. He admitted a little sheepishly that he had only ever read wheels through a screen, first in a classroom and then in the field, and had never once used a bar the way the older inspectors described it in the training manuals he'd studied years before. Frank offered him the bar, almost without thinking. He showed him where to strike and how long to wait for the sound to settle. Nathan tried on a nearby wheel. The sound came back clean and ordinary. He looked faintly pleased with himself, the way anyone does the first time an unfamiliar sound finally makes a kind of sense. Frank mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Earl Pruitt used to say a wheel would tell you everything, if you were patient enough to let it finish talking. Nathan repeated the phrase quietly, testing the shape of it, the way a person tries on a coat that belonged to someone else first. Frank asked him, in turn, what the technical program had actually taught him about wheels themselves beyond the machine's numbers. Nathan thought about it longer than he expected to. He talked about tolerances and thresholds, about calibration schedules and failure curves printed in a manual back at the district office. He admitted, after a moment, that no one had ever once mentioned what a wheel was supposed to sound like. It had simply never come up. Frank said that was probably not anyone's fault. The world had a way of teaching new things by first setting the old ones down, sometimes before anyone had finished learning everything the old ones knew. It was, in its own small way, the beginning of something neither man yet had a name for. By late afternoon, the light over Oakridge County had turned the color of wheat. It stretched long and low across the rail yard, catching the dust that always seemed to hang near the grain elevator. The freight cars sat waiting for their evening departure. Nathan came by once more to confirm the train was cleared for the main line. He mentioned, without any edge to it, that the readings had all come back clean. Every wheel, every car. He asked if Frank had anything else to report before the paperwork was finalized. Frank said there was one wheel he wanted to look at again, just to be certain. Nathan did not object. He had no reason to. The readings were clean, and there was still time before the scheduled departure. He said he would wait, mostly out of courtesy, and stood a short distance back. Frank crouched down beside the seventh car once more. This time he brought a small mirror and a hand lamp, along with his bar. He struck the wheel a third time. The sound came back exactly the way it had that morning, dull, where the others rang clear. He angled the mirror beneath the rim. He moved the lamp slowly along the curve of metal. He was not searching for anything large, only for the kind of thin hairline seam a person could walk past 100 times, unless they already suspected it was there. It took nearly 10 minutes. The light shifted along the curve of the wheel, catching nothing at first, only clean gray metal and the faint shine of grease near the axle. Frank moved the lamp a half inch at a time, patient in a way that only comes from having done something wrong before long ago and never wanting to repeat it. The yard had gone quiet around them by then. Most of the crew had already left for the evening. A single floodlight buzzed somewhere overhead, throwing long shadows across the gravel. Nathan shifted his weight, waiting, saying nothing. He had never watched an inspection take this long before. His own device would have finished in seconds and moved on. He found himself, without quite meaning to, holding his breath along with the older man beside him. Frank worked his way around the rim a second time, slower now. He checked the same section 3 times over, unwilling to trust a single pass. The mirror caught the lamp's glow and threw it back in a thin, bright line, sweeping slowly across metal that gave up nothing. Then he found it, a crack no wider than a single strand of thread. It ran along the inside edge of the wheel, where the rim met the web. Still too small, too new for the electronic probe to have caught it that morning. Not yet a danger, but exactly the kind of flaw that grows quietly under the stress of a long haul, mile after mile, until one day it stops being small. Frank did not call out. He did not straighten up in triumph or wave Nathan over to look. He stayed crouched a moment longer. He ran his thumb once along the hairline seam, the way a person touches a scar they already know the story of. Then he stood. He brushed the dust from his knees. He told Nathan, plainly, without any weight in his voice, that he had found a crack. Nathan came closer. He looked for himself, following the beam of the lamp to the exact spot Frank pointed to. It took him a moment to see it. When he did, something in his expression changed. Not embarrassment, exactly. Not quite surprise. Something closer to stillness. The particular stillness of a young man realizing the world had just shown him something his training had not yet covered. He did not apologize out loud. He did not need to. He asked, quietly, how Frank had known. The device had read the wheel clean, only hours earlier. Frank said only that the wheel had sounded a little different than the others. He said it the same way he might describe the weather. A plain observation. Nothing more. He did not mention the 31 years. He did not need to. They were already there in the calm of his voice, in the ease with which he had waited all day for a chance to be certain rather than simply right. The car was pulled from the train before departure. It was set aside on a spur track for closer inspection at the larger depot down the line. A full ultrasonic scan, hours later, confirmed exactly what Frank's ear had already told him that morning, long before any screen agreed. The rest of the train left Oakridge that evening, on schedule. It carried the season's grain out past the county line, past farms whose names Frank still knew by the sound of their trucks, out toward mills and markets far beyond anything the depot windows could show. Herb Callahan's wheat rode out in that same train, in a car 3 back from the one that had been set aside. He would never know how close the whole shipment had come to trouble. He would never know how a small white X, drawn low beneath a brake shoe, had quietly kept that trouble from ever reaching the main line. He simply drove home that evening, same as always, past fences and fields turning gold in the last of the light, trusting a system he had never once had reason to question. Nathan stayed at the yard a little longer than his shift required that night. He went back over the readings from earlier in the day. He studied the numbers the way a person studies a test they were certain they had passed. He did not find fault with the device. It had done exactly what it was built to do. It had simply not yet learned what 31 years of mornings had already taught the man walking beside him. Somewhere past the edge of the yard, the grain elevator stood dark against the last of the evening light. Somewhere beyond that, trucks rolled home along quiet county roads, carrying farmers back to porches and kitchen lamps and suppers already waiting. None of them would ever know a wheel had been marked with chalk that morning. None of them needed to. The whole point of the work Frank did was that it mostly stayed invisible, felt only in the safe arrival of a harvest no one thought twice about. The depot office stayed lit a while longer than usual that night. Nathan filled out the incident report by hand. It was the department's standard form. He found himself adding a line at the bottom the form did not require. He wrote that the flaw had been identified through manual inspection prior to electronic confirmation. He looked at the sentence for a moment before setting the pen down. It was true, plainly stated, and it felt like the least he could do. Before leaving, he glanced at the old ledger drawer near the office window, the same one that still held the faded record of Herb Callahan's grandfather's shipments. On impulse, he pulled it open. Page after page of handwritten entries, decades of them, dates and car numbers, and initials belonging to men whose names meant nothing to him. He wondered how many of those entries carried a story like tonight's, quietly folded into a single line of ink, never explained, never needing to be. He closed the drawer gently. The way a person closes a door on a room they have only just learned to respect. He walked home himself not long after, past the same fence lines he had passed for 31 years, past the same bend in the road where the wheat gave way to the first houses of town. His wife had the porch light on, the way she always did when he worked late. She did not ask about his day in any great detail. She only asked if it had been a good one. He said it had been an ordinary one. Most days, that was the same thing. He sat a while on the porch before going in, listening to the last of the crickets and the far-off, faint sound of a night train somewhere past the ridge. He thought of Earl Pruitt again, gone now almost 20 years. He wondered whether the old man would have approved of the new device, or simply waited it out the same patient way Frank had. He suspected it would have been the second. Earl had never been a man in a hurry to be right. He had only ever wanted the wheels to be safe. His wife came out and sat beside him for a while, saying little The way two people can share a porch without needing to fill every quiet minute with talk. She asked, eventually, whether the new supervisor was settling in. Frank said he thought so. He said the boy asked good questions when he remembered to ask them at all instead of trusting the screen first. She smiled at that, the small, private smile of someone who had heard her husband describe younger men this way for 3 decades running, always a little skeptical at first, always coming around in the end. Frank did not disagree with her expression. He only shrugged and looked back out at the dark line of trees past the fence, where the sound of the night train had already faded into nothing. The next morning began the way most mornings at the Oakridge Depot began. The sky still held the last gray of night. The grain elevator stood quiet against the horizon. Frank arrived early, as he always did, and started his walk down the newest line of cars, steel bar in hand. Nathan arrived not long after. He carried his device the way he had every morning since it first appeared in the yard. But this time, he did not walk to the far end of the train. He fell in a step a short distance behind Frank instead, close enough to watch, saying nothing, simply following the older man's pace, wheel by wheel. Frank struck the first wheel of the day. The sound rang out clean and true across the quiet yard, the way it was supposed to. He glanced back once. The smallest motion. He nodded for Nathan to come closer. Nathan stepped up beside him. He held the device down at his side, rather than raising it. He listened instead. The wheel rang again beneath the bar, clear as a bell in the cold morning air. For a long moment, neither man moved. They stood together in the pale, early light. The whole yard sat quiet around them. The grain cars waited, patient the way they always did, and the sound settled somewhere between the two men, like something finally being understood, without a single word needing to explain it. You just met Frank Doyle, a man who spent 31 years listening to something a screen couldn't yet hear. So tell us, where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever known you were right, and chosen to wait quietly for the proof instead of arguing for it? We read every single comment. See you in the next story.